Hi students, I'm sorry I couldn't be with you today. My son is homesick, but I didn't want us to get too far behind, so I made a little video that I hope will be helpful to you in working independently, and we will meet again on Tuesday of next week. Um, and there are no readings due for that time, and the only thing that I want you to complete in the interim between now and Tuesday is the using sources assignment in Blackboard in Canvas, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that. First, I wanted to talk a little bit about the storm very briefly, give you some information on that. Um, the storm is known for a lot of things. One of the things that it's a good example of is how setting can influence a story. So, setting is the time and place of a story, and this can include lots of different things. It can include the landscape, and sometimes it's just the backdrop. Sometimes it doesn't mean a lot, but a lot of times it gives you information about the characters, their motivations, their personalities, what drives them, and or it can reveal something about their interior thoughts. So in the storm, what we're looking at are several layers to the setting. We're looking at where it takes place, which is Louisiana. We're looking at when it takes place, which is the 18th and 19th century. We're looking at the weather at the time, which is, it's tame, and then there's a big storm that comes, and then the storm clears. And all of these really function in this story to inform the theme of the story and the characters. We'll talk about that in a minute. So, like I said, setting can be anything that reveals the character's surroundings. So, if a story is set in contemporary society, then that can inform what the characters are concerned with. Or if it's the Great Depression, the Civil Rights Movement, the American Revolution, the storm is set, in a time before women had a lot of rights, and they were expected to marry. They were expected, marriage was supposed to be the end all be all of a woman's life, marriage and family. There was something called the cult of domesticity at that time, which was psychologists and sociologists had studied this idea that, really the meaning and purpose from a woman's life all derived from having, making a home for her family. And certainly not having any kind of sex drive or sexual feelings, as we see with Calixta in The Storm. The place, whether it's urban or rural, can have effect on the characters, whether it's well known or not well known. Now, Chopin tended to write about Louisiana and New Orleans, that area. A lot of her stories take place there. That's where she was from. Um, but we do see in that culture kind of a hotspot or a burgeoning of more passionate feeling than you might expect from somewhere in the Northeast or something like that. So when we look at Louisiana and New Orleans in particular and that surrounding area, because of the influences of the French in that area, you see a little bit more progressive thinking at times, but still, during the time that Kate Chopin wrote The Storm, certainly the idea of a woman having sexual feelings was not something that was written about. And then to top that off, for her to have an extramarital affair, and for that affair to be driven not by, you know, um, a cruel husband, or for sex to be forced on her, but for her to just be a willing participant, um, that was really risque at that time. The weather in the storm is very significant, right? So we get in the beginning there that it's fine, that her husband and son go out to the store, and they're away. And meanwhile, her old crush comes along, Alce, and then it starts to storm. And it storms so heavily that they have to go inside, even though, they try to just take cover on the porch. Alce comes inside, and they have to put something underneath the door to keep the rain out. And all of this could be interpreted as a metaphor also, which means like a comparison using figurative language, for their passion, right? That they're trying to not let their passion in, they're trying to keep it out. However, their passion is a storm. And if you closely read, a lot of the elements of the storm mirror the passion that is going on between Calixte and Alcée. So as the storm, thunder and rain and wind escalate, so too does the temptation for them to come together um, and have sex. And that's what they do. And then once they do, oh, it's amazing. The storm passes, right? So you see that mirroring of the storm and their actions. And then at the end, it is sunny, which is interesting too, because if a woman in a text was going to have an affair at that time, usually there would be some kind of consequence for the affair spelled out. She would meet some kind of punishment, whether it was, because she died or something like that, but the author or the society at that time would punish her. But in this story, we have the storm passed and everyone was happy. No one gets any punishment. Everybody is good. In fact, they seem almost better than they were before the storm ever happened, before this extramarital affair ever happened. So Chopin really deviates a lot from the norm of what was acceptable and what was expected in this story. So I said Chopin is sometimes known as a regional writer, just like Faulkner wrote a lot about Mississippi. And Flannery O'Connor, we're going to read her soon. She writes more about Georgia, but also the South. That Chopin wrote a lot about Louisiana and New Orleans and that area. And this doesn't mean that their themes and ideas are not relevant to other areas. It just gives us a particular insight, usually to the culture of that particular area. So this is kind of a fun thing if we were together, I think, to do, because you do start to realize some connections. If you want to pause this video and just write for 2 minutes to yourself on a little scrap piece of paper, how do you think the area that you have been raised in or that you currently live in is influencing or has influenced you, whether it's the way you speak, the way you dress, your manners, your religion, the foods you eat, the music you like, the beliefs you have. I always think that being from Florida, I was born in South Florida and raised there, and I moved to Central Florida as an adult, but I've lived in Florida, pretty much all my life. And I do think there is a friendliness to Floridians that you don't necessarily experience in the Northeast or even in the very southern parts of Florida where it's more fast paced and people are very busy. So I think that is part of me growing up in Florida. I always think the way I dress too is more casual because as Floridians, it's usually too hot for us to dress in many layers or with, nicer closed-toed shoes, that kind of thing. So Floridians tend to dress a little bit more informally. And the foods, I think there's a lot of Caribbean influence in Florida and a lot of seafood in Florida. So I know whenever I go, I've traveled to Colorado quite a bit, and whenever I go there, I'm always looking for seafood, and there's usually a lot of, meat on their menus and things like that, and hearty food. And I think, well, yeah, I guess it's cold all the time, and this is the mountains, so that makes sense. Or if I travel to, my husband has worked out of Memphis, Tennessee, so we've traveled there before, and I'm always amazed, like, they have rich southern food, a lot of fried food, again, a lot of meat, a lot of pork, and barbecue, and whereas, especially in South Florida, I feel like any nicer restaurant you go to is going to have kind of healthier fare or seafood on the menu. It's really hard to find, a salad without bacon in it in Tennessee. And I'm not disparaging that because bacon is wonderful. But I do notice that there are different food influences in these areas. So that's kind of interesting to see those connections. And then you can see them in the stories. So, Again, setting varies in terms of how much it influences the characters. Most writers don't set out specifically to say, "Oh, this is the setting," and it directly correlates to this attribute in the character. Some do, some do. They really make that connection, and when the setting really does strongly dictate the characters' personalities or their futures, it's often referred to as naturalism. So that's one of those terms you probably want to note. And it's interesting to me that two books, because I'm very interested in Florida literature, but there are two books I read last year, Fates and Furies and Swamplandia, both set in Florida. And it was so interesting to me how I saw so many connections between the characters being raised in Florida and their personalities, especially because in Fates and Furies they were juxtaposed with other characters who were from other parts of the United States and just acted completely differently. So, some background on Chopin. She did not try to publish The Storm during her lifetime. I think she knew that that was not going to be well received. And really, a lot of her works, she had works that were somewhat similar to The Storm in theme, and she had to wait 7 decades, or her works did, she wasn't there, before they were published. Um, and as I said, though she was determined and she wrote a lot about issues that were not widely accepted during the late 19th century, she a lot of her female characters expressed sexual feelings, and that wasn't the norm. So these are some questions to think through if you have someone in your class to talk to about this. These might be some interesting ones to discuss, especially number 4. I think you could even write a whole paper about that. Or number 3, what significance does the title The Storm have for the story? And I say besides the obvious be that there was a storm in the story, but how does it function as figurative language to tell us about the characters and what they feel and think? Number 4, the last line of the story says, "The storm passed and everyone was happy." Do you think this was and will be true? This is a very odd ending, right? We expect someone to face consequences from this action because this is unethical. I think by most standards, most people would say no. If you get married, you make a vow, you make a promise. So, what then is Chopin saying? This overlaps with 5 about, you know, sex, love, and marriage. What attitudes does she imply in this? And again, a lot of these possible writing questions are on the assignment sheet. So you can look at these if one of these appealed to you. I don't know if that second bullet point is on there. Did Calixta really love her husband and family? Is it possible to interpret it that she did? That might be an interesting thing to write about. And then again, you could argue that last bullet point is true or false. The values of Louisiana society in 1898, which were that women should devote themselves exclusively to domesticity, are as much to blame for Calixta and Alcée's affair as their own lust or love. That could be something arguable. And I'm going to skip that. So the other thing I want to talk about is this assignment that I would like you to complete. So if we go to our Canvas shell and we scroll down on that Home tab, there is this assignment called Understanding Sources. And I don't like the way this is viewed. I can make it bigger here. So what I would like for you to do here is choose one of the following literary criticism essays and read it closely. So not all of these, but either There Will Come Soft Rains, Emily Grierson's Oedipus Complex, Buried in the Bedroom. And I would say try to pick which essay based on which story you think you're going to write about. So if you think you're going to write about Cathedral, read the one about Cathedral. If you think you're going to write about Telltale Heart, write about Telltale Heart. Doesn't mean you can't change your mind for the literary analysis essay, but thinking forward to that, which text, which short story do you think you're going to want to write about? Now, when you click on the link, it's going to prompt you to log in to our library databases because that's where these are housed. So you're going to have to put your XID and your 6-digit birth date, which is going to be in month, date, year format. And once you click that, it should bring you in. If you have trouble getting in, I would say try to contact a librarian. There are different ways to do that, and I'll show you how in a minute. But if you still can't get through, just let me know. So this is the source itself. This information on the page you see, there's just bibliographic information and an abstract, which gives you a brief summary of the article. This is, and it tells you it's 9 pages long. So a lot of these are about anywhere from 7 to 12 pages long. And this was published in 1980, and it focuses on the motive of Oedipus complex in the story A Rose for Emily by William Faulkner. So you might remember, if you've taken any psychology, that the idea of an Oedipus complex is something Freud came up with. So we're looking at a psychoanalytical critical theory here. Challenges in identifying the motive in the story. So, the motive, remember again, that psychoanalysis, what drives Emily to act the way she does. Description of a psychotic personality, recognition of the superficial aspects of the character's bizarre conduct. So it gives you kind of an idea of what this is, but to actually access it, sometimes it's right below this. You can scroll down and there's like HTML version of the text, but sometimes you have to look to the side to get this PDF full text version. And that's where you actually want to go through and read this. And again, I encourage you to annotate this or to take notes on this as you read it to try to understand it. Some of it will be difficult because you're not a psychologist. So when this critic, Jack Shirting, starts throwing around Freud and different names and terms, that might be a little bit challenging, but please persevere and go through it. So that's the first thing you want to do, is closely read your text. Then second, and you may want to skip this because we're not meeting in class, but if you have somebody from our class, verbally paraphrase your whole source for a classmate. If you have the same source, take turns paraphrasing each paragraph. So basically, try to go through with somebody, or even on your own if you were not in class, and say, okay, this is what is happening in this paragraph. This is what the author is saying, putting it in your own words. And then the author is saying this, and then the author is saying this. So basically just going throughout the whole thing, page by page, slowly, and trying to understand what the author is saying. And that's just verbally. You don't have to do any writing for that. But number 3, choose one paragraph from the literary criticism essay and paraphrase it in writing. So this can be any paragraph. Maybe you want to choose, I would say try not to choose a paragraph that just summarizes the story or mainly summarizes the story, because then you're really paraphrasing the story, not this critic's interpretation of the story or analysis of the story. Like this paragraph seems largely to be what's his name? Jack Shirting's summary of it. But then we get into some analysis. So here, if Faulkner had intended readers to infer that Homer Barron had jilted Emily or that he intended to jilt her, we would expect the author to provide some substantive evidence as a basis for an inference. There is only one allusion to jilting in the history of this protracted affair. So he goes on. So basically, if I was going to paraphrase that paragraph, I would talk about how the author is suggesting that that Homer Barron did not jilt Emily, and that there's not evidence for us to believe that instead he believes yada yada yada, whatever he believes, which I'm not going to tell you because I want you to read that. Okay, so you choose one paragraph and paraphrase it in writing, and I'll talk very briefly about, or hopefully briefly about, what a paraphrase is. But basically, it's putting the author's words in your own words, and but not summarizing. Summarizing is when you condense it and just put it the main ideas. So a paraphrase is going to be a paragraph because you want to keep a lot of the same detail in there. It's not going to be very short or much shorter than your paragraph. Ideally, this would be a paragraph where you think the author searched something interesting or insightful or disagreeable about the story, not just a paragraph of facts or the author's retelling of the story's plot. Because again, when you go to write your literary analysis essay, you don't care about what the critic says about retelling the story. You can do that. And also, you want to respond to the critics when they say something that you think is interesting or insightful or disagreeable or in some way provokes a response in you. So, we don't just want to quote them to quote them. We want a purpose in our response, which is that we think we have some kind of response to them. Somewhere in the paraphrase, include an in-text citation. For how to cite using MLA in text, see here. And if you follow this link, they give you the basics. And I'm going to attach a PowerPoint too that kind of goes over some of these rules with you for more. But the general guidelines are for in-text citations, you want to give credit to the author of the source and the page number that information appeared on. And you can do that either by including the author in the sentence and the page number parenthetically, or both the author and the page number parenthetically. Either one is good. And you want to do this for paraphrases, summaries, and direct quotations, not just direct quotations. Sometimes students forget that if you put an author's words in your author's ideas in your own words, you still have to give them credit. And again, I'll put a little separate video up for that. So that means that if you are quoting or summarizing or paraphrasing this article, that you're going to have shirting somewhere in there in that sentence or parenthetically at the end. And then whatever page number you're pulling the idea from, 397 or 398. If it's across pages, it might say 397-398 because it starts here and goes over to here. So you want to give credit in that way. Now, if there's no known author, I think all the sources I linked to do have an author, but if there isn't a known author, then it will tell you how to cite that as well, or a corporate author. But I think this should suffice, this information, for completing number 3. Number 4, after that, compose a paragraph. So this is another paragraph where you respond to the author's analysis of the text. Somewhere in your response, make sure to include a brief direct quotation. So that means like copy and pasting word for word. And do not give me, and when I say brief, I mean like one sentence or a phrase. Don't give me a whole bunch. And I want you to respond to it. So a response can be, did I include it in here? A sample response, I think. No, I didn't. So a response could be, in this article by Jack Shader, he argues that Emily kills Homer Barron because her dad has given her an edible complex and she is in love with her father and Homer Barron is a replacement for him. And then you tell me, what is your response to that? Do you agree? Do you disagree? Do you think that there are parts you agree with and parts you disagree with? Do you find it disturbing that the author comes up with this? Do you think that the author is reaching? So when I say response, that's what I mean by response. What are your thoughts or feelings about what the author said? You should avoid dropping your quotation as a standalone sentence and instead integrate it with your own words. So what I mean by that, if you follow this link, it talks about different ways to introduce direct quotations. So instead of just dropping it like as its own sentence, I think there's an example here. Sorry, I thought there was a non-example of what not to do, what it looks like to drop something. But basically, if you follow these directions and you say, okay, you either do introduce the quotation with a complete sentence and a colon, or use an introductory explanatory phrase, or make the quotation a part of your own sentence. I want you to try to use one of these. And again, this is a completion grade, this homework, but you have to hit everything in order to get that completion grade. So you don't have to do it exactly correctly. If you have, incorrect commas in the right place or something like that, or your analysis isn't completely insightful or fluid, I'm not grading on those kind of things. I'm grading on, do you do all the things I'm asking you to do? And so I tried to give you some ways to provoke a response here too, in case you're stymied and going, well, I don't know what to respond to or how to provoke thoughts toward the author. That's something to think about. And then finally, on a separate page, you want to compose a works cited page for the literary criticism essay. So, and I say, remember, the databases often give you a citation. So I will also put a link here to a sample works cited page, but remember that a works cited page, if I can show you here, that a works cited page is the final page of a paper when you write it. So your literary analysis paper is going to have this final page called the works cited page. That's what MLA calls it. And that's where all your sources are going to appear. Anything that you summarized, paraphrased, or directly quoted in your essay is going to appear on this page. But MLA says they want you to have a certain format for it. Now, part of the format is the first line is flush left, subsequent lines have a half-inch hanging indent, the whole page is double spaced, sources are in alphabetical order. So all of these things are the works cited rules. But as for how to compose the actual citations, you can go to the MLA citation guide and look that up, and I'll show you more about how to use that in the next video I'm going to make. But the great thing about the databases is, if I can go back here, is that a lot of these databases give you this option to cite or cite now. And if you click on that and you go down to MLA format, you have to scroll down here, you can just copy and paste this citation, Control C, into your works cited page. Now, see, that happened to me. So I should have, let me show you again. So one of the things that is good to do is, instead of just hitting Control V, is going right click and going to your paste options, because if I keep the source formatting, I get that ugly bar around it. If I do merge formatting, then I get everything I want, like italics and everything. If I go keep text only, I don't get my italics. So I want to go to this middle merge formatting and click on that, and then it gives me what I want in there. So the other thing that this doesn't have, a lot of times the databases do have all the necessary information, but one thing they don't have is the access date. So you need to put whatever date you accessed it. So for us would be accessed 1 Feb 2018 period, and then we're finished with our citation. So that should be a pretty easy thing for you to do, that number 5, because again, it's number 5. Because again, they give you that in the databases. You've just got to copy and paste it and create a works cited page. So hopefully this information is helpful. Please go ahead and email me any questions that you have. I'll be checking my email today and tomorrow. I changed the due date on this, so it is due at midnight on February 2nd, so by tomorrow at midnight, but hopefully you can work on it during class today, and since we're not meeting, and have some time for that. All right, please let me know if you have any questions. Signing off.